African Ascent is honored, truly honored, and I mean it from the depths of my heart, to bring to you Paget Henry, Professor Paget Henry from Brown University, whose specialty ranges all the way from Africana philosophy, past Caribbean philosophy, ranging and going to political economy, and then returning to an original combination of sociology, philosophy, and political economy. The best way of introducing Paget Henry, who is my friend, my colleague, and my mentor, who gave me a position that took me to places a few years ago when I worked with him at Brown University, is to recall this instrumental hiring that he made of a frequent guest of African Ascent and his stellar performances, Lewis Gordon. It was Paget Henry who was chairing the Department of Africana Studies at Brown University, who literally discovered this young, vibrant, dynamic, courageous, and brilliant to a fault scholar by the name of Lewis Gordon, whom African Ascent has had at least twice, and he has promised to be one of our regular contributors. Paget Henry takes great pride in being both a scholar of a first order, and I mean that. There are those who have compared his work in terms of its systematic ambition, its remarkable capacity to organize chaotic data, huge chaotic data, by developing schemas and tropes and categories under which he subsumes massive historical information to that of the great German sociologist slash philosopher by the name of Jürgen Habermas. So his work, for example, among many other works, Caliban's Reason, is a serious discourse, a serious interrogation of African history, African tradition, Caribbean history, and Caribbean tradition, in which he attempts to bring into one coherent, synthetic whole the contributions of people of African descent who found themselves in various parts of the world, up and including the famous and pleasant Caribbean, to some places of which I had the honor to go to a few years ago, namely Barbados. And my next plan, when an opportunity presents itself, is to see Antigua, the Antigua that produced not only Paget Henry, but also the great novelist, writer, Jamaica Kincaid. So Caliban's Reason, about which we'll speak, is an attempt that attempts to be both actional, that is to provide concrete policy guidelines that will enable the subjugated, the oppressed, and the wretched of the earth to free themselves from these oppressions and exploitations of all sorts, on the one hand. And on the other hand, it also leaves powerful scholarly contributions, so fertile and so imaginative that the intention of the scholar is to produce future graduate students who are going to unmine and analyze even further these works that he is leaving for us. So African Ascent is honored and privileged to bring Paget Henry from Brown University for the first time. Welcome to African Ascent.
Thank you, sir.
How are you, sir?
I am so good, and it's a pleasure to be here. I love the name of the program, African Ascent.
Thank you so much. Now, as I was preparing for this interview, which is quite an undertaking, because you've done so much, not only have you written Caliban's Reason, you have also founded one of the most impressive annual conferences that takes place in different parts of the Caribbean, along with Lewis Gordon and many others, namely the Caribbean Philosophical Association. Not only that, you are also the founder and editor of the famous, supra-famous journal, the CLR James Journal, named after one of the greatest Caribbean thinkers that the world had ever seen. So in light of all this, reading on you so as to interview you really kept me busy for a few days. So let me begin with the following
Sure.
question, just for reflections. There was this Italian Marxist whom many describe to be the best Marxist that the Marxist tradition produced, on whom when I was quite young, naive and young, wrote my first book on, by the name of Antonio Gramsci, who once wrote in his philosophical notes that all human beings are philosophers. If that is the case, why is it that one of your compatriots, a very intelligent one, namely Tim Hector, complains that the Caribbean has not produced philosophers? How could that be? Because if the first proposition is true, then the corollary proposition that we can make about the existence of philosophy everywhere must also be true. And yet Tim Hector does not think that it applies to the Caribbean situation. Correct him.
Well, no. I mean, his question was, where is our philosophy? And I thought that the question was very pointed, because it really didn't say that it did not exist. It's just that we couldn't find it, you know? So there's a difference between saying your philosophy is lost as opposed to saying it doesn't exist, right? And so his question became a challenge for me to find it. I knew it wasn't a matter of making it up, but a matter of finding in which cupboard was it hidden, you know? And so the challenge of writing Caliban's Reason was really a challenge of bringing to light the key aspects, and in particular, the ontological and epistemological aspects of Caribbean philosophy. Because there was no question that there was a Caribbean political philosophy. The figure of Garvey was too well known, you know. The figure of Edward Blyden, the critiques of colonialism, of the state, these were very well known. And so the question was, where is the ethics of Caribbean philosophy? Where is its metaphysics, its ontology, its epistemology? Because even up to today, but particularly at that period in time, the core of philosophy was seen to be these areas: metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, epistemology. Huh? And so the argument was that you know, Afro-Caribbean philosophy, African philosophy, African-American philosophy had nothing to say on these issues. That these dimensions of it just didn't exist. You know, so I was very skeptical about that claim, and for me, it was a matter of finding out what cloud of invisibility had covered over this aspect of Caribbean philosophy. So I just went digging, you know, literally. I felt as though I was on an archaeological dig, trying to uncover something that had been buried, you see. And as I continued to dig, of course, I knew it would be there, and it was. You began to uncover, first and foremost, the African heritage. You know, what Caribbean people inherited from their African ancestors. And, you know, in the book, what I try to show is that the one thing that survived the Middle Passage, survived slavery, survived being racialized, is the concept of what is a human being. You know, what is a human being? Africans gave a very profound answer to that question. So profound that it survived, you know, all of this oppression. That in spite of the attempts to eliminate it, to Christianize it, to defame it, you say, that's one of the things that you can go to the Caribbean today and see. Right? And in a nutshell, you know, what we have is a conception of the human being as, you know, a subject that has a spiritual core. And in addition to this spiritual core, you have an I, or an ego, right? And the ego is our organ of everyday self-consciousness. It is through the ego that, you know, you're Ethiopian and I am Antiguan, right? The ego adapts to the socio-historical environment, right? So that, you know, if you were born in Japan, you probably would be speaking Japanese, you know? And if I were born in Egypt, if I were born in Ethiopia, maybe I would be speaking, you know, some of your languages, right? So the ego allows us to adapt to the socio-historical environment, right? And of course it does this primarily through its ability to speak a language. That it is language that sort of inserts us into the everyday social world and lifts us out of nature. Right? That language, you know, is sort of one of the major constituents of the socio-historical world. The ability to speak, to create together, to worship together, to be political together, to create economies together, you say. All of this language helps to facilitate and to bring us into the socio-historical world. So without the ego, you say, we could never really be in history the way that we are. So the ego is a very positive formation, right? We need it. It's vital to our existence. However, for the Africans, you see, there's a problem with the ego, right? That, and to sort of put it into language that would be accessible to an audience who has grown up mainly in the United States, we could say that the problem with the ego is it's narcissistic, right? That it's very difficult for it to see beyond itself. You know the myth of Narcissus. He looked in the mirror, thought he was so beautiful, why look at anything else, you know? So the ego is like that. It sees only what it wants to see. It sees only what furthers its immediate existential interests, you say. And the problem with that, you say, is that in this pursuit of its own existential interest, as it perceives it, is that it could, in fact, you say, negate its spiritual core. It could lose sight that it is essentially something spiritual. Right? And so the whole drama of the ego, you say, that is at the core of the African conception of the person, right? Is to guard against this egoism, to learn how to puncture it so that it doesn't capture you. Because to be genuinely whole, to really fulfill your humanity, you see, you must be in touch with that spiritual core. The spiritual core and its creativity has to flow through the ego. It has to inform and motivate the ego if it is to really fulfill its great potential. And the ego has great potential. You know, when we meet a great person, we're so impressed. You know, when you meet a Martin Luther King, you know, a Mandela, you know that these are outstanding people. You know, and for the African, you see, you become great, you see, when your ego is open to the creativity of your spiritual center and it's flowing through you. That's what allows you to keep growing and be a great human being. You know, that's the simplest way in which I can outline this conception of a human being. All right? In the sense that you cannot just be a doctor and be a great person. No. You have to be a doctor who is open to his or her spiritual center.
I see.
You see? And to the extent that the creative energy of your spiritual center is flowing through you as a doctor or as a lawyer or as a professor, as a mother, as a father, then and only then will you really fulfill your potential as a human being. Mm-hmm. Is it? And that idea has persisted, it has survived, and you can find it in the Caribbean today.
It's incredible. And additionally, correct me if I'm wrong, but there is also this chain of beings that is particularly true of African oral traditions, this connection between the chief god, the gods and the goddesses, the ancestors, the spirits,
right,
the climate, the environment, the atmosphere, and so forth and so on. When we put all these chains together, what do we end up in the end that has relevance to what you call the African conception of the person?
Well, the conception of spirit and what we mean by the spiritual world is again something from Africa that has survived in the Caribbean. Now, spirit is a very elusive concept. It's very hard to grasp it, and you really can't pin it down. And, you know, the great African sages made no attempt to pin it down. They knew that you could not pin it down. It is, in fact, ungraspable by the human imagination. Right? So, they thought of spirit in many ways that were obviously contradictory. So, you had this impersonal conception of spirit at the same time that you had a very personal conception of spirit. Right? So, when I was in Ghana and I was interviewing a sage, you know, he saw me as, he says, "You're a lost brother. They've got you. You've been so westernized in the Caribbean. So I'm going to give you a Western metaphor to help you understand the African conception of spirit." All right? And he says, this is the impersonal conception of spirit. And he said to me, think of spirit, you know, as a vast ocean of electrical energy. And think of all of creation as a set of electrical appliances. He says, don't care how great you are, whether you're a refrigerator, whether you're a television, whether you're an iPad, whatever. None of us work unless we're plugged in. You see? You must be plugged into spirit as this wonderful ocean of creative energy. Right? And then in the next breath, he said, of course we think of spirit in very personal terms. The gods, the goddesses, the ancestors, you see? So I was saying, but, you know, spirit as energy is almost amoral, you know? It gives energy to the bad, and it gives energy to the good, you see? You know, but when you think of spirit in personal terms, as a god or a goddess, then they become very moral beings. They're always talking about what's right and what's wrong, you know? And so we had a great conversation about the tensions between these two ways of talking about spirit, you see? And he made no attempt to resolve that contradiction. He says because in the final analysis, when it comes to spirit, you can't put it all together. It eludes every conceptual net that we try to put it in. Right? So that was his reason for not really trying to resolve the contradictions. So in the Caribbean, we have lots of the African gods have survived. You know, in Santeria, Cuban Santeria, Haitian Voodoo, Pocomania in Jamaica, you find a lot of the Yoruba and the Dahomean gods. They're very much a part of religious life in the Caribbean. Sure. What's interesting is that another thing that has really survived and is actually growing in popularity in the Caribbean are the Adinkra signs. You know, they're very popular. People now tattoo them on their arms, on their chest, you know, that sort of stuff. And the Adinkra signs are really wonderful, wonderful set of signs because together they give you a visual account of this conception of the person that I was explaining earlier. So so a lot of people relate to this conception of the self through these visual signs. And so the most famous one, or I should say the most popular one in the Caribbean is Jiname, the sign which says, accept God. You know, accept God is here, and then you can add whatever you want. Because God is in everything, you see? So you can fill in, you know, accept God, you know, and you can fill in just about anything you want because, you know, accept God did, I couldn't do, you see? So these are the ways in which the African heritage survives in the Caribbean. So we want to thank you for this heritage. Came from you.
We thank you also. And now, every time I read Caliban's Reason, I read it for the third time about 2 weeks ago. I'm impressed by what I called in the introduction while I was introducing you, with this remarkable gift that you have to organize huge data by developing tropes. They seem to flow out of you. Such tropes are, for example, poeticism, historicism, and philosophy. Now, one could argue, Tim Hector notwithstanding, that the distinct contribution of Caribbean thinkers to what we call philosophy, when it is narrowly understood, are the poetic and the historicist contributions that are aligned with the Caribbean experience. And in that philosophy need not necessarily serve as an umbrella for these contributions, but rather philosophy itself becomes possible because of the poeticist and historicist traditions of the Caribbean.
Sure. You see, I think that in a colonial society, philosophy takes a very specific form. You know, the consequence of colonization, and when you add to that enslavement, racialization, you see, it transforms the philosophical imagination. Now, if you look at philosophy in Africa, you look at philosophy in pre-colonial India, you know, you look at philosophy in Europe, there is a tendency for questions of ontology, epistemology, and so forth to dominate philosophical discourse. So you can almost say, in a normal society, right, these are the aspects of philosophy that come to the fore, right? But colonial societies are not normal societies. They are highly abnormal, right? In the sense that one group is distorting and denying the humanity of another group in the interest of extracting its labor. So you are living under very, very abnormal conditions, you see. And so philosophy then, you know, gets pressed into the service of relieving this oppressive situation. And so what happens is that questions of a historical, political nature, questions of your identity as a human being, come to the fore in ways that they did not when we were in Africa. Huh? So, if we look, for example, at the Haitian Revolution, very, very important event in the history of African peoples. And as you know, C.L.R. James did the classic study of the Haitian Revolution. Right? And when you look at what Toussaint and his generals did, you see, this to me, it remains one of the most potent, powerful statements of, you know, African, or if you'd say Afrikaner, political thought and praxis. Right? James characterized Toussaint's philosophy as black Jacobinism, right? A political philosophy that wants to challenge the politics of colonialism. The politics of colonialism is basically saying that Europeans have a right to rule Afro-Caribbean people, that Afro-Caribbean people are inherently incapable of governing themselves, that they are naturally slaves, you say. And not only that, you guys are not really African. You know, you are Negroes, right? And then they said, you know, let me tell you what a Negro is, you see? And so we get the discourse of the Negro. And this is what Fanon called the negrification of the identity of the African. Right? And so all of this is going on. And this is what philosophy in a colonial society challenges. Right? As a Negro and a slave, you're not allowed to own land. You can't testify in court against a white person. I mean, all of these things that are clearly restricting your humanity. And my book, Caliban's Reason, the reason why I chose that title, is because of what the drama in Shakespeare's play, The Tempest. You know, in this play, Shakespeare is having Prospero, who is this British aristocrat, who arrives on a Caribbean island, you know, and you know, he looks at the natives and he's saying, you're not part of the human race. You're part of the animal kingdom. But let's give you language, you see? Let's carry out a little experiment to see if you are really human, you see? So the dialogue between colonized and colonizer is one that begins, you see, on the assumption that you are part of nature. You're not part of this human world that I described earlier that you automatically inherit with an ego. That the ego inserts you into a human socio-historical world. This is what gets negated, you see, in the discourse of Prospero. And for me, you know, when I talk about Caliban's reason, you see, it is a way to say no to Prospero. And this is what, you know, I see Toussaint doing. You know, he's saying, no, we are not slaves. We are not Negroes, you know. We have rights. We can own property. We can govern ourselves. We can create states, you know. And to me, this is what philosophy has to do in a colonial society. Just think of the American case. I would argue that some of the best philosophy written by Euro-Americans, right, were the documents establishing the American Republic as they were attempting to free themselves from British colonialism. The Federalist Papers, right? And you can compare the Federalist Papers with the writings of Toussaint Louverture. Toussaint wrote a constitution, all right? You know, and so to me, by putting the national question on the table, you see, philosophy has to shift, you see. It can no longer occupy itself primarily with issues of epistemology, you know, metaphysics. When somebody's got his foot on your throat, it's hard to be metaphysical, you know? You know that foot is real. You can't raise the question, is the foot real, you know? Is it matter? Is it spirit? No. You want to get that foot off, you see? So in a way, I think the experience of oppression reorients the nature of philosophical praxis. And we see this, you see, in these philosophies of historicism and poeticism. In poeticism, we see this taking up of the question of black humanity, the humanity of people in the Caribbean. And in the historicist discourses, we see this question now of the role of the state. What can we do? If we reclaim the state, what can we do with it? You see, if we reclaim the state, we can, you know, enter the stage of history, and then the question becomes, what are we going to do while we are on the stage of history?
Remarkable. And to engage you further, our colleague and our friend, Lewis Gordon, makes analytic distinctions between what he calls philosophizing in black and Africana philosophy. Do you buy these distinctions? Is there a difference between philosophy in black and Africana philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, you can see that, okay, you know that in Africa, people don't, prior to colonization, nobody referred to each other as black. Nobody called each other Negro, right? So the very term black, the term Negro, these are all, you know, designations that emerged in the exchange between Prospero and Caliban. Okay. Right? the term black represents a racializing of African identities. Why didn't Africans call themselves black? Because they called themselves Akan, Yoruba, Ewe, right? They were all cultural identities. So that the culture that you were rooted in, right, was the marker of your identity, you know? It wasn't the fact that the color of your skin was black, right? So when we talk about black philosophy, you say, this is an attempt to deal with this process of negrification. So that you will recall that in Black Skin, White Mask, Fanon says that his aim in this book is to explore the being of the Negro. What does it mean to be a Negro? You know, what is this state of being that is labeled Negro? Because he knew that this was a creation, right, of the whole colonial experience, that before colonization, it didn't exist. So what is it, you say? And so in Black Skin, White Masks, you say, he gets into the exploration. And of course, in that famous chapter, you know, The Meaning of Blackness, you know, where he really gets into what it means to be black, you say. This would not make any sense outside of this process of colonization. So, you know, so I think when Lewis talks about philosophizing in black, you say, he's articulating a philosophy that is going to emerge out of this process of being racialized and negrified, you see. And the philosophy can either take you out of it and return you to being an African, or an Afro-Caribbean, an African-American, Afro-Brazilian, you see. But very often, once you get into this philosophy of the Negro, the being of the Negro, you discover that this is an imposed creation, you see, and that, you know, it's not you. You're not a Negro. You're an African, you know, or an Afro-Caribbean. And you begin to then assert yourself as such. And so, I mean, today, as you can see, you know, the term Negro is fading into the mists of history. And I think that the poetry, the literature, and the philosophy that we've produced is what has helped to destroy this stereotype.
Mm-hmm. So you contend that the portrait of the first sage, of the first thinker in the Book of the Dead would laugh if he were to be described as a black thinker.
Right.
He was merely a thinker.
Yes. You know, I mean, as you know, you defined the tradition I thought very accurately in your book on Zara Yacob as a sapiential tradition, right? A wisdom tradition. This is the tradition that we came out of in Africa, right? It had nothing to do with being black, being racialized, being a Negro. And this is no part of the tradition. That got inserted there, right? Once we became the labor force of Western capitalism.
And as you know, these sapiential wisdom traditions had ontologies, ethics, metaphysics into a single invisible totality.
Absolutely.
It would have been impossible to think of what thought is if it wasn't mediated by metaphysics, by ontology, and by ethics, because right. They are part and parcel of what makes philosophy.
Of course. You know, so really, you know, you can see the distortion that comes with colonization, slavery, and racialization. So that's why it's so important to always go back to what we were before slavery, before colonization, you know, it's so important in determining who we are now, you see, and you have to be able to make those connections. And as I said, the concept of the person is the thing that has survived, at least in the Caribbean. That's the great gift we've gotten from you.
Well, thanks to you, and thanks to you. And it's also you who once very ironically told me, when we were speaking about Zara Yacob, and you said this brother managed to retain a modicum of freedom by resisting the process of niggerization.
Well, of course.
I remember that conversation
vividly,
because it's so apt. And so there you had a thinker who is attempting to retain a method of thinking that he is developing from the sapiential tradition, convinced that he has it, and in that he is not the absence of being, but the presence of being.
Not only that, but the presence of reason.
The presence of reason.
You know, that he's confident in his capacity to reason, that he's a rational subject and very much an African.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And now, as I said again in the introduction, your interests are so far-reaching. You're not merely an ivory tower scholar, although clearly you're superb at it, but you're also following Fanon, for whom both I and you have tremendous passion.
Absolutely.
Actional.
Yes.
You want to participate in changing the human world, sometimes even on the behalf of the subjugators. While you're changing the condition of the subjugated, you also want to change the condition of the subjugators.
Of course.
Now, and one way by which you try to make philosophy alive, correct me if I'm wrong, is through your intricate study of political economy. What is political economy?
Well, for me, political economy is that combination of politics and economics that determines the availability of the material basis of your life. Right? That very often the way the state interacts with its economy becomes the key to levels of productivity and hence the level of resource availability in a society. Right? And so precisely because we are coming out of a situation of serious material deprivation, to me, understanding our political economy becomes crucial if in fact we are going to deal with the problems of poverty that we have inherited as a result of the history of colonization, slavery, racialization. Right? And we are struggling, as a people, we are struggling to fashion a new political economy for ourselves, you know? And not only have we tried to fashion this political economy, but we've also struggled to implement it. And very often, the processes of implementing it, have gotten us into trouble with the big powers, you know, because our political economy very often runs contrary to the interests of the imperial powers, our ex-colonial masters. Yeah? So if you look at the history of Africana political economy, right? Basically it runs this way. First, you have revolutions like the Haitian Revolution. Right? Oh no, sorry. Before the Haitian Revolution, we have the Maroon societies. right? And if you look at maroon societies, right, these are groups of enslaved Africans who decided to break away, take to the hills, the inaccessible hills, you say, find locations where they had the military advantage, so that if the British, the French were coming to engage them militarily, they could always see them coming, you see, and use that as a military advantage. And that's how a lot of the maroon communities survived. Now, if you look at a lot of these maroon communities, within them, the political economy was very African. They created African kings. Their farming was traditional African farming. And so they literally created traditional political economies in a lot of these maroon societies. So to me, that's the beginning of the history of political economy in the Caribbean. The next stage would be the Haitian Revolution, like the Haitian Revolution, right? And one of the really, really challenging questions that come out of the Haitian Revolution, right, is that after taking power, Toussaint had a choice. Do I continue the plantation system, you say? Now, or do I follow the maroon tradition and create a traditional African political economy? The masses of Haitians wanted the latter. Toussaint said, well, look, if we go back to a traditional African political economy, basically a peasant economy, right? Here's what's going to happen. We won't be able to generate foreign exchange because we're not, this is not a trade, this is not a big trading economy, right? We need to buy weapons to defend the revolution. And the Haitian currency, whatever we use as currency, nobody's going to accept it on the international market in exchange for weapons. So Toussaint took the decision, a very unpopular decision, to reintroduce the plantation system, you see, and to force the Haitian peasants to work on the plantations, which they saw as a reintroduction almost of semi-slavery. So the Haitian peasants resisted by just walking away and taking to the hills. Right? So in a way, the Haitian peasant was sort of repeating the maroon solution. And so eventually, the attempt to reintroduce the plantation system collapsed, you see? And so the Haitian economy is this betwixt and between. Large-scale agriculture, employing peasants who don't want to be employed, but who want to be self-employed. And so you have these two systems competing against each other, you see? And this was the big problem of political economy coming out of the Haitian Revolution. And of course, on the state side, the state became very militarized in the post-revolutionary period. So this is not good, right? On the state side, you have the militarization, process of militarization. And then on the economic side, you're betwixt and between two economic systems working against each other, right? Now, if we look beyond Haiti, even though, you know, what Haiti did was in many ways so important, right? The lesson there is that we did not solve the political and economic problems that needed to be solved. Right?
Remarkable. We have about 5 minutes left, I think, and my viewers, who are quite huge, are wondering, and I want you to satisfy their appetite. Sure. Give them a skeletal outline of a normal economy that would revive what we in the 70s used to call Pan-Africanism.
Okay. Now, you know, as I told you, I'm working on the follow-up to Caliban's Reason. And I'm calling it Further Studies in Caliban's Reason, subtitle Africana Phenomenology and Political Economy. Right? And in the political economy section of this work, what I'm trying to do is to take the political economy that emerged at the turn of the 20th century. Since the turn of the 20th century, political economy in the Africana tradition has been primarily a mix of Pan-Africanism and socialism, right? Starting with figures like Hubert Harrison, really sort of brought the two together. And A. Philip Randolph, so forth. But this mix, to me, has now run into a lot of problems.
Which, what we're going to do with this mix is, I know you're very busy because he's also the chair of one of the most powerful departments in the country, Africana Studies at Brown University, but I'm going to twist his arm to come and do a full interview on this second book. And now we have about a minute and a half left, and I would like my viewers to know on this Antiguan photographer that you're also working on.
Yes, he's my friend Mali Olatunji, somebody I grew up with, and for 21 years he worked as one of 3 fine arts photographers at the Museum of Modern Art in New York.
I see.
Right. And then he just gave it up on a whim, not knowing why, the typical artist. I'm just going to give it up. I feel it, And for 5 years, he just drifted, not knowing where he was going. And so then, of course, by the end of 5 years, he's beginning to worry, oh, geez, what have I done? What have I done? Gave up this great job, something like that. And then in the 6th year, he started taking some taking some photographs like none that I had ever seen. And basically what he was doing was using lines of wood to transform ordinary photographs. Of
course, I'm going to twist this great scholar's arms, whom, as I say, is very busy revamping and rejuvenating a powerful department of Africana Studies at Brown University, to come back and do a full-fledged interview with the first part on his current project, strictly on economic and philosophical matters that are going to enable blacks in the diaspora and blacks globally to find an alternative to their dire economic condition. And the second part of that interview, if he so agrees, would be to look at some of these photographs that he is saving from oblivion on the behalf of a friend whom he grew up with. This has been your host, Teodros Kiros, for African Ascent.